All right. Okay, so good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. All right, so I'm going to talk today about poverty and a project we did called the PovertyCure project. So it's really so concern for the poor is at the heart of Christianity. If you look at the Gospels, if you look at the tradition of the church, there is at the center this deep concern for the poor. The Holy Father, Pope Francis, has spoken of this often in the last year. It's a lot of water.
Great.
Thank you. All right. So the Holy Father, thank you, has spoken a lot about poverty in the last year. As we know, we've talked about this a little bit last night. St. John Paul called poverty one of the great moral challenges of our time. And so care for the poor is not an option in Christian theology and Christian life. St. James in his epistle summarizes the gospel when he says that pure religion is this, to care for the widow and the orphan in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Now, I actually think it's important and quite interesting, especially in modern context, that what pure religion is, that St. James defines, is to care for the widow and the orphan in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. What you tend to find, this is not always the case, but what you tend to find is in fact one or the other mentality, where those people who are concerned with social justice, as we heard Father Ronheimer talk about in the last lecture, tend to focus on the acts of charity, etc. it might be, or social justice, or advocating on behalf of the poor. And sometimes even those who are concerned with liturgy and sacraments and moral philosophy maybe sometimes don't think so much about the poor. I think it's more on one side than the other, but nevertheless, I think it's very interesting that James says what pure religion is to care for the widow and the orphan in their distress and to keep oneself unstained from the world. So we are called to be in the world, but not of it. We also know from Catholic tradition that almsgiving is one of the eminently good works. And then to ignore the plight of the poor can have terrible consequences for our souls. Pope Francis wrote in Evangelium Gaudium, said, almost without being aware of it, quote, he says, we end up being incapable of feeling compassion at the outcry of the poor, weeping for other people's pain and feeling a need to help them, as though this were someone else's responsibility and not our own. The culture of prosperity deadens us. We are thrilled if the market offers us something new to purchase. In the meantime, all those lives stunted for the lack of opportunity seem a mere spectacle. They fail to move us, end quote. Now we see this, quote, clearly in the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. So Augustine, commenting on this, says it was not wealth that sent the rich man to hell. It was his indifference. He just didn't care. All right? And this is very important because sometimes you think it's not wealth that's the problem. It's indifference to the plight of the poor. Now, as Father Ronheimer mentioned in the last lecture, care for the poor is not simply only a matter of charity. I mean, it is that, but it also can have a justice aspect to it. And St. John Chrysostom, in his commentary on this this passage, talks about the importance of justice in our relationship to the poor. So, it is clear from the Christian tradition, it is clear from the Gospels that we are called to care for the poor. We are called to have a heart for the poor. But it is more, I would argue, the Christian call to help the poor is not simply a call to do something on behalf of poor people or to feel feelings on behalf of poor people. We are endowed with reason, with logos. So our charity must be ordered by reason and oriented to truth. Pope Benedict writes in Caritas in Veritate, only in truth does charity shine forth. Only in truth can charity be authentically lived. Truth is the light that gives meaning and value to charity. That light is both the light of reason and the light of faith. Without truth, charity degenerates into sentimentality. I think this is a very important thing. I need you to think about it. Without truth, charity degenerates into sentimentality. So this means that our charity and our desire for justice must be rooted in prudence. Right? And we talked about this last time. Joseph Pieper, I think, has a lovely definition of prudence where he says, prudence is seeing the world as it is and acting accordingly. Right? So, and again, we talked about this last time. Imprudent charity can actually increase injustice. So we could hunger for justice or hunger for social justice or get involved in charity. And sometimes our desire for justice and charity can actually create injustice, increase injustice. Okay? There was once a famous rock star who said, in the face of poverty, he said, we have to do something, even if it doesn't work. We have to do something, even if it doesn't work. All right? Now, this man is quite commendable. I mean, he really gets young people to be concerned about poverty, etc. But he's forgetting something, right? He's thinking that his act, his something that he does, okay, something that he does is either going to do good or going to be neutral. But what if there's a third option? What if the something he does actually makes things worse? What if it harms the people we're trying to help? So I mentioned this in the last lecture, but I think it's very important. I'll mention it again. That's why Aquinas reminds us that justice can be destroyed in two ways: by the violent act of the man who possesses power and by the false prudence of the sage. Okay? So we must have a heart for the poor. We are called by God to have a heart for the poor, but we are also called to have a mind for the poor. Right? We are not what I would say we are not kind of just do-gooders. There used to be a bumper sticker in the United States that said, practice random acts of kindness. Okay? Christians are not called to random acts of kindness. Christians are called to exercise the virtue of charity, ordered by reason and oriented to truth and oriented to the good and the flourishing of the person that we're trying to help. So what I'd like to do in this lecture is look at three things. First, examine the dominant approach to charity and social justice, and argue that despite very good intentions, it has not been as successful as hoped, number one. Number two, I'd like to discuss the underlying theological and philosophical problems with the current model. And then number three, I will argue that the biggest obstacle for today's poor is not that they lack material goods. All right? There's a very famous, reasonably famous kind of Christian organization in the United States, and the head of it has often said, if North American Christians could just get together, we could be more generous, we could raise $84 billion, and we could eradicate extreme poverty. Ladies and gentlemen, the answer is no, we couldn't. Because poor people are not poor because they lack stuff. Poor people are poor because they lack the institutions of justice, right? What John Paul called circles of exchange. And without these, they lack the capacity to create prosperity for their families and communities, okay? So that's the outline of the lecture. So part one, the major social justice response to poverty is what I would call the foreign aid and charity model, the foreign aid and charity model. Now, let's skip that. At the end of World War II and the breakup of colonialism, the dominant ideal at the time, right, was that if you could just deploy large amounts of resources, if you could send over big, huge sums of money into the developing world, you could jumpstart the process of development, and countries could make the leap into industrialism, right? And this is pretty much the standard. Now, this comes out of the standard thinking of the time, out of World War II. The idea that we won the war, now let's win the peace. We planned the war, we can now plan prosperity. And so the intellectual fashion of the time was planning and also large industrial plans. I mean, you had the Soviet Union doing 5-year industrial plans. You had the Japanese doing it, the Americans, everybody doing these things. And in fact, this, I think, is the context in which Pope Paul VI, wrote his encyclical Populorum Progressio. So now, however, as time has passed, and as we look at it from a longer perspective, the success of the model comes into question. Right? This strategy has, I would argue, created a poverty industry. Right? And like other industries, part of the goal of the industry is to stay in business. Let me show you this. So this is a little bit hard to see maybe from here. But what I think, if you look at kind of how poverty works, how the poverty industry works, is this. People extend their tax money. Okay, let's say this is generally, this group over here are Europeans and Americans. Okay, Japanese, right? Swedish, all the European countries, etc. Okay, so they send their money to go to the donor, to their country's government. All right, and then that taxpayer money goes to international organizations like the United Nations and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, etc. And some of it, and then it gets sent over to the developing world for projects. All right? And then some of the money gets, as foreign aid expanded, some of the money would start going to NGOs, non-governmental organizations, consultants, or charities. All right? And so what happens then is as these groups begin to develop over time, what I would argue is that what happened is a poverty industry emerged. Right? And like I said, what's the goal of any industry? Is to stay in business. And so, again, this is not malevolent, but this is taking economics seriously and taking incentives seriously. What actually happens is if the poor people get out of poverty, there will be lots of people who lose their jobs. So the incentive of the poverty industry is not necessarily to create long-term sustainable development and independence. The incentive of the poverty industry is, in fact, to stay in business. Okay? I don't mean that they're bad. I mean that they're human. All right? So this is a very complex industry. We could spend lots of time explaining it and the different ways it works. There's lots of players with overlapping incentives, and I'm not going to go into that. But what I want to do is briefly examine three main approaches to helping the poor within this system. Large-scale foreign aid, non-governmental organizations, private charities, and maybe a little bit of time on social entrepreneurs. Okay? So, foreign aid. There have been some individually successful aid initiatives. For example, much of the early response to the Indian Ocean tsunami saved many lives. At the same time, if we look at the overall track record of foreign aid, of what are called government-to-government transfers, okay? Foreign aid is not like me taking a dollar and putting it in the church, basket. Foreign aid is government-to-government transfers, okay? The results are mixed at best. The National Bureau of Economic Research says that there's really no correlation between aid and development, all right? And some people even say it's, there's a lot of data out there. I did about more than 100 interviews for the PovertyCure project. My colleagues and I did about 200. And we talked to experts from Africa, Asia, Latin America, entrepreneurs, a host of other people. And one of the things we began to learn and heard, not just from theory, but from their experience, is how aid, in fact, creates problems. Senegalese businessman Malik Fall told me that aid has delayed the development of business in Africa. Right? He said it has kept Africa behind. Why? Because when foreign aid is given, it can actually crowd out local businesses. So when you give money or projects and you're doing something for free, the local businesses end up having to compete with foreign aid. Even worse, aid often becomes linked with big businesses in the United States and Europe and powerful interest groups to create this, and they all kind of compete for advantages, and they lock out smaller local businesses. So Ghanaian entrepreneur Herman Chinere Hesse told me this story. He said, 5 companies got together. They're Ghanaian companies in Ghana, right? 5 companies got together to bid for a business. I mean, bid for a contract, okay? I bid for a contract, a business deal. And everything was going well, and they were making progress, and they were very qualified to do the work, et cetera, et cetera. And their competitor was a European company. All right, their competitor was a European company who got their government to make a soft loan to Ghana on the condition that that European company would get the contract. So the Ghanaian, Herman told me the Ghanaians came up and they said, the government came up to them and they said, look, we love you guys, okay? But nothing beats free money. He said, you know what happened? We lost our bid. Okay? And he actually described it. He said, that's not aid. That's not assistance. That's thuggery. Another example is in the realm of agriculture. Here's what we do to the developing world. In Europe and America, we subsidize our farmers to so-called protect our farmers. Okay? Then we overproduce, and we ship it over either as aid, or more likely, we dump it over at artificially cheap prices. And we distort local markets, and we put local farmers out of business. Okay? Then what do? Then we blame free market capitalism. That competition hurts the poor. But ladies and gentlemen, this is not competition, and it's not a free market capitalism. What it is crony capitalism. So the answer we get to how we ruin local markets is we need to regulate more. And who do you think sets up the regulation? The same businesses that had lobbied in the first place. How many small entrepreneurs have lobbyists in Washington, D.C. or Brussels? Nobody, right? So you have this crony capitalism begins to develop. Let me give you an example. In the United States, the Guardian newspaper in England reported that out of $1 billion in agricultural food aid in the United States, 70% went to 3 large companies. That's $700 billion in subsidized purchases. So foreign aid can at times in emergencies be helpful and necessary in a natural disaster. But this is the short term. The problem is we have used foreign aid and the emergency model as the long-term model for economic development. Okay? Now, the interesting thing that comes of this is that foreign aid can also be described as a new type of colonialism. Okay? I was talking to one guy. He said he was talking to a Haitian, and he told me, he said this Haitian said to him, you know, first we had colonialism, then we had neo-colonialism, then we had neo-colonialism, and now we have développement, which is just another kind of colonialism. Right? And so you actually have really what you have is a neo-colonialist model running, that underlies this foreign aid system. Okay, now there are a lot of things we could talk about. Okay, we could give lots of examples, but let me address one thing more before I go on. Beyond the problems of economics, there's another justice problem. I guess it's an economic problem as well. That's a moral question with foreign aid. Now, oftentimes, when aid is given, it comes with what are called contingencies. Okay, so for example, if I'm going to give you, say, $20 million to do a project or $20 million for your economy, there's certain things that you have to do, okay, in order to get that money. Now, these can be problematic because of what Hayek talks about, the knowledge problem, right? Because you have bureaucrats outside the country making decisions on how the money needs to be used when they don't have local knowledge, okay? But let me give you some of the problems are beyond that. They're actually moral evil. So often the United States and Europe gives money to the developing world on the condition that they implement population control programs. Okay? So Western nations and international organizations often impose this not only Western secular Enlightenment view, but actually impose population restrictions on developing countries in condition that they get the aid. Charles Palmer Buckle, who's the Archbishop of Ghana, put it this way. He said, they impose a culture of death instead of a civilization of love. Now, many of you probably know that the United Nations Millennium Goals number 4, which is improve maternal health, okay? Number 4 is improve maternal health. Many of you probably know it includes abortion, okay? And the United States government, for example, funds abortion in the developing world. Okay, this kind of goes back and forth. There's the Mexico City Accord, and now the United States actually funds abortion in the developing world. So over the last decade, Western governments and international organizations have spent billions of dollars promoting population control throughout the world. Despite, ladies and gentlemen, despite the fact there's no evidence that population creates poverty. Remember what I talked to you about last time? When you pull all of your money together and you divide the room in half, right? You lose a productive capacity. So what happens is a person goes down to the developing world. They see poor people like, zapatos, por favor. They see all the children, and they think, oh my goodness, we've got to do something. If we could just reduce the number of people, there'd be more money to go around. Okay? And like we said in the last talk, that's a snapshot. In doing that, you're destroying the productive capacity. So it's an economic fallacy, but it's also an anthropological fallacy. It doesn't recognize the dignity of the person. It doesn't recognize the creative capacity of the person. It sees people as burdens. But people are not burdens. People are, first of all, they have intrinsic value. But second of all, they're also capable of high levels of production. All right? So, however, I'm not saying these population programs have not worked. When I say they have not worked, I do not mean that they have eradicated poverty, right? But they have worked. They have reduced populations. There's a problem, of course, and unintended consequences that you can imagine. We've already talked about economics and unintended consequences. When you encourage people to have small families, what kind of child do they normally choose? Do you know? They choose male child. They choose boys. So what we have, ladies and gentlemen, is an unprecedented change in the boy-girl ratio. And this is not only in China. Don't think this is only in China. We have what the New York Times has called the daughter deficit, and what The Economist magazine has called gendercide. What happened to 100 million missing baby girls? Now, the shortage of girls is already creating problems, and it's going to create more as time goes on. All right? First of all, from a Christian perspective, we know that it is not good for man to be alone. And when there are no girls, man is alone. And when man is alone, man tends to do what, gentlemen? He tends to go to war. Amidst other things. Okay? The other thing that happens is that when there are, buy a Porsche, yeah, what else? Let's see. Buy a Porsche, be a simple banker. Yeah. Yeah, okay. Yeah, exactly. Depends who you are, I guess, yeah. And so the other thing that happens, of course, is that girls become a commodity. When there's a shortness of girls, they tend to become commodified. And so what you already see is rise in human trafficking in girls as commodities, and it's deeply problematic. All right. Anyway, I could say more about aid, but let me move on to the next big kind of dominant way in which we handle charity, and that's called non-governmental organizations, or NGOs. What are you NGO in ONGs, they're called in French and in Spanish. What do you call it? ONG, right, in Spanish. What do you call it in Austria? NGO? NGO? Okay, yeah. Because it's ONG in Spanish. All right, so let's talk about non-governmental organizations, or NGOs. These are another important part of the poverty industry. Now, we tend to think of NGOs as private, non-profit organizations with altruistic motives, and many of them are. Okay, it's true. But it's also the case that some of the large international organizations get huge amounts of funding from governments and from international organizations. All right? So if you just go back to this slide here, you see that governments are actually giving money into NGOs and charities. Okay? So there's a couple of problems. One is these are not necessarily non-governmental organizations as much as they are government-financed private organizations, or what I would call para-state organizations. They are actually arms of the state, okay? Which is also a question, by the way, to think about, not talk about now, but in the light of what does subsidiarity mean? Does subsidiarity mean devolution, or does it mean that you actually have private voluntary organizations that are not necessarily funded by the state doing the work? Hermann Chinner Hesse, the man I told you about before, gave me an example. He said, look, what happens is the UN and the World Bank and all these, big, European and American governments come in and they do social pressures, whatever it might be, whatever is fashionable in Europe and the United States. In policy, they do it. And they're pressuring on the government. And then you have non-governmental organizations pressuring up from the grassroots. But what's happening oftentimes is that those non-governmental organizations are actually getting paid by the governments. So you have this double pressure, right? It's not grassroots, it's astroturf, right? It's fake grass, all right? And this is a serious problem and related to this kind of colonial mentality. So you're imposing these colonial ideas and then you're paying activists to encourage it among the people, all right? Now, let me give you another example of money. Catholic Relief Services in the United States, okay? Catholic Relief Services, which is a big Catholic, development organization. According to its own reporting, gets about or over 70% of its budget from government money. Catholic Relief Services gets about 70% of its budget from government money, okay? So we tend to think of Catholic Relief Services as, oh yeah, the Catholics go to church and you put your little coins in the basket and I want to help out. But actually, most of their money is coming from the government. Now, there's a saying in the South of the United States, Texas and other places, that says, if you make a deal with the devil, you are always the junior partner, okay? The question is, what's happening with all these organizations like Catholic Relief Services that are taking government money? Now, is it intrinsically wrong to take government money? No, it's not intrinsically wrong, okay? But the question is it prudent? Is it prudent for Catholic organizations to take government money? Is it wise? And I would argue, most likely no. Why? At different points, it can create conflicts between the interests of the state and what the church is trying to do. It can reduce independence. It can identify a church organization with state or state policy, domestic or foreign. And it can also be an opportunity for cooperation with evil, material or formal, depending on the situation, most especially with questions of abortion. So if you're getting lots of government money to do kind of health things and what if abortions are taking place, I mean, it becomes very dangerous. And this is one of the critiques of Catholic Relief Services. So that's one of the problems. The other problem, oh, there it is, yeah, 70%. Okay. All right, the other problem is that, like foreign aid, non-governmental organizations can also crowd out local entrepreneurs. Okay. When my colleagues and I were in Haiti, we visited a company making solar panels in Port-au-Prince, in the capital of Haiti. Okay. Here you see Alex George talking to me, showing me the solar panels. Okay. Now, how many people, by the way, knew that Haitians could make solar panels? Haitians, people in Haiti, did you know they were making solar panels there? No. Most of the image that we have of poor countries is that they just have a rice bowl. They have a rice bowl. Like they just kind of need our help. We have an image in our mind of poor countries that's not always accurate. Right? So usually when I ask how many people knew that they could make solar panels in Haiti, very few people raise their hand. They're kind of surprised, like, oh, I didn't know they could make solar panels in Haiti. Why not? Is it surprising that Haitians could not make solar panels? It's very interesting. I mean, even in large crowds, and people go, oh, you're right. I never thought of that. Okay, but anyway, they make them. Now, Alex George and Jean-Ronel Noël are the founders, and they hire people from many of the little cities out in Port-au-Prince. Okay, places called one of the places they hire is a place called Cité Soleil, which in 2006 was ranked by the United Nations as the most dangerous place on the planet. Okay, so the guys who own INERSA, Alex is one of them, they hire men to work in their factory from very poor, dangerous places. All right, so this is not, and this is important. I want you to think why it's important. What happens, okay? So NGOs, so what happens is when NGOs ship free solar panels into places like Haiti, they actually make it hard for companies like INERSA to compete, okay? So Hermann Hesse explained it to me like this once. He said, I'm about to start a business. An NGO gets whiff of it. They smell about it. They're like, oh, because it's topical. Solar panels, shoes, whatever it might be, clean water, whatever it might be. And they get foreign aid money to provide it for free. So what happens to my business? I have to lay off my staff. So INERSA told me, the guys at INERSA told me, before the earthquake in Haiti, they were selling about 50 streetlights a month. They make solar panel streetlights. They're selling about 50 a month. After the earthquake, despite the increase in demand, in 6 months, from January to June, they sold 5 streetlights. Okay? Why? Because it's hard to compete with free stuff. All these NGOs, and they began to send over solar panels. And so what they actually did is undermine local business. Right? Now, people are getting paid, by the way, for these solar panels. Don't think that it's all like everybody's doing it for free. It's, there are people giving free things away, but there's also a lot of money being exchanged, okay, in Europe and the United States. So what happens is we have to ask ourselves a question. The men who work in this place are fathers and brothers, but they're fathers with children. So when we give away free things, are we actually creating the incentive to create unemployment for fathers? Okay? Through subsidized either tax money or other subsidized questions. Now, if the goal of our charity is to actually help people in the developing world, then are we really helping if we're giving away free things that undermine local business? It's a question to ask. And then who's making the money off of it? Now, it's not only limited to foreign aid, ladies and gentlemen, and it's not only limited to charity, to non-governmental organizations. The same things happen in charity. Here's an example of unintended consequences. When I was in Haiti, I met Corrigan and Shelley Clay. They're an American couple, and they went to Haiti to adopt a child and to start an orphanage. Now, what they discovered is that, okay, well, let me tell you what happened, actually. So they went down, they were going to adopt the child. And they met this little boy, and everything was fine. And then the orphanage director said, "Would you like to meet his mother?" Okay, is she fine with that? Is she okay? She goes, "Yeah, no, she's fine. She comes to visit him every week, and she brings him things." And so they began to talk to her. And they said, "Well, why are you giving," she obviously loved the child. Like, why are you giving your child up for adoption? She said, I just can't afford him. I'm living in Cité du Soleil, and it's a bad place, gangs, violence. I can't afford the baby. So I'm giving him up, the little boy. And the mother, Shelley, the woman, she said, not the woman who was going to adopt, she said, it was this shock. Here I am spending $20,000 on an adoption for a child that a mother wants? And the injustice of it, she said, struck me. So they began to discover, why is it doing that? They began to discover, there we go. They began to discover that after talking to different orphanages and orphanage directors and things, that about 80% of orphans in Haiti, 80% of orphans in Haiti actually have at least one living parent. And the New York Times, in fact, has a story where this is a government statistic, that about 80% of children, of orphans in Haiti have at least one living parent. So they told us, and there's a whole host of things going on. They told this other story. They said there was one boy, he was about 14 years old, and he said, they said, "Hey, you're about to be adopted. Are you excited to go meet your new mom and dad?" And the boy, 14-year-old boy, said, "They're not my mom and dad. My mom and dad live here. I know them. I'm like the special child who is sent to the orphanage to go, and I'm going to go to the United States with these people, but they're not going to be my mom and dad." Okay? Well, the mother and the father, the adoptive parents from the United States, they didn't know that. They thought they were adopting an orphan. And so there's a whole great set of incentives where Christian charity has created incentives for parents to give their children away. So Corrigan and Shelley went down with about $30,000, and they were going to start an orphanage. But instead, they said, well, okay, if we get $30,000, we'll have to raise money, start an orphanage. The real problem isn't that there are orphans. The real problem is that the parents don't have jobs. So why don't we start a business? So with $30,000, they went down to start a business. Okay? Now they have 220 workers, and they do more than $30,000 a month for their workers. And they're caring for over 700 children. Okay? I met a woman, and we actually talk about this in our film that's coming out. I met one of the women there was about to give her children away. She was able to save money, buy property, and build a house where she lives with her family by selling these things, right? And so what happened is they used the principle of subsidiarity and thought, why are we, wait a minute, and this is a question. Now, I want to be careful. I'm not saying that we shouldn't care for orphans. Pay attention. I'm saying oftentimes Europeans and Americans see poor people like, oh, care for the children, children, children. It's sentimental sometimes. But what about the principle of subsidiarity? Should we first think about how to partner and help the parents to take care of their own children? And if the fundamental unit of society is the family, this makes more sense. Okay? So, these are some of the problems. All right? What I'd like to do now is move to the second part of the lecture and focus on what I would say are the underlying problems with the dominant model of humanitarianism. All right? Oh, yeah, here. Here's their business. All right, right there. Okay. I would argue that the dominant idea of how we engage with the poor is not charity, but humanitarianism, which is a secular, hollowed out, and materialist version of Christian charity. Okay? Now, let me be clear here. I'm speaking right now to a Christian audience, so I'm going to talk in Christian terms, right? I mean, I think you can make this same case to a secular audience, which I have, is that modern humanitarianism has limited horizons. It doesn't recognize any kind of potential of the person, right? It is really based on what Nietzsche and Max Scheler called ressentiment and a transvaluation. It focuses on comfort. It focuses on providing material needs, but doesn't go past that to asking questions about the spiritual nature of the person or the capacity for human flourishing. So let me focus on a Christian sense, because I want to make this contrast for you to think about. So, humanitarianism generally focuses on providing needs and providing comfort. Now, I'm not saying you should not help provide needs, but I'm saying that's not the end. Charity, on the other hand, is something different. Because charity is caritas, it's agape, it is Christian love, right? It is the seeking of the goodwill of the other, right? The intentio benevolentia, the intention, the desire for the good of the other person. So the goal of charity, of love, Christian love, is not simply to make ourselves feel good, nor is it simply just to meet needs, but it is to help promote human flourishing, all the while keeping the eternal destiny of the person in mind. So, as we heard in the beginning from Pope Benedict, authentic charity must be rooted in truth, specifically the truth about the person, or it loses its focus and becomes sentimentality. So too often, we forget, in our desire to help, in our desire to solve a problem, we can forget the inherent dignity of the person. So we tend to say, when we see poverty, we're like, oh my goodness, there's poverty. What can I do to solve it? Now, in some ways, that's good, because you want to do something. That's great. But I would argue there's a better question. And the better question is not, what can I do to solve poverty, but how do people in the developing world, how do people in poverty, how do we help create the conditions for them to create prosperity for their families and their communities? This is a different question than merely what can I do to help, right? Because if you're a poor person, what do you want? Somebody to give you something, or to help create the conditions of justice so that you can create prosperity for your family and your communities? Think about Father Ronheimer's lecture on social justice. What do you need for social justice so that you can create prosperity for yourself and your family, right? I talked to a Haitian, and he said, we're talking about shoes, and he gave this, we were talking about different ways of doing it. He said, look, no one wants to be a beggar for life. No one wants to be a beggar for life. People want to they want to take care of their own families. Just like the women that were taking care of their children. They weren't giving their children away simply because they wanted to be beggars, but because they didn't have jobs. And when you create the opportunity for economic growth, people tend to step up and take care of their families. So by shifting the question from what can I do to how can we help create partnership, how can we help create the conditions for in the institutions of justice for wealth creation, it doesn't mean we're not involved, but it takes the focus off of me as the savior, as the hero, as the wonderful person, and puts the focus where it belongs, on the person. Okay? Let me give you another relation to this. Because I think what happens is, the second problem is related to this, is that we can oftentimes make poor people the objects of our charity, instead of the subjects and protagonists in their own story of development. We turn poor people into the objects of our charity, of our pity, of our sentiment. Okay? In fact, Cardinal Bergoglio said something very similar. He said, we cannot, quote, we cannot, Cardinal Bergoglio is Pope Francis, right? We cannot truly respond to the challenge of eradicating the exclusion of poverty if the poor continue to be objects, targets of action by the state and other organizations in a paternalistic and aid-based sense, instead of subjects where the state and society create social conditions that promote and safeguard their rights and allow them to build their own destiny. End quote. I was happy when I read that. It's great. So how do we engage with the poor? Not as heroes, but instead in a partnership relationship with the poor as the protagonists of their own development. Okay? Now, let me give you an example to help you think about this. Okay? This is very simple. It's something that everyone experiences. All right. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. It all comes back to the beginning. All right? And if you remember in the Bible, he creates Adam, and then he puts all the animals in front of Adam, right? All the animals in front of Adam, and he names the animals. But he's unsatisfied. So God puts him into a sleep, right? And then from his rib, he creates Eve, and he puts Eve in front of him. And Adam sees Eve, and what does Adam say? He says, what? No, he doesn't say that. He says at last, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, at last. And so Cardinal Scola in his book, The Nuptial Mystery, this is how he identifies. He says that Adam sees identity and difference. Identity, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, and difference. Right? And in that difference is a call to communion. And from that communion comes another subject that God wills for its own sake. All right. Now, the fall takes place. And what does the Bible say? You shall desire your husband, and he will lord it over you. You shall desire your husband, and he will lord it over you. And so what you could say is that the difference comes in front. And Cardinal Scola explained, the gaze of Adam stops at the difference. And he turns Eve into an object for his own gratification, and Eve vice versa. So the problem is that we turn each other into the object for our own use, instead of the subject, instead of another subject willed for their own sake, with hopes and dreams and fears, etc. Now, analogously, right, and all of you understand that, right? Because you experience this. You experience yourself treating others as objects, and you experience yourself being treated like an object. Well, analogously, perhaps with less gravity, but nevertheless analogously, this is what we can do to poor people. We can make poor people the difference of the poverty. And they become the object, not of our desires maybe, but of our sentiments, our pity, and wanting to feel good about ourselves. And so one of the things is that one of the challenges that underlying the humanitarian model is this objectification of the poor as objects of pity. These two things get combined with one of the dominant problems of our time, which is social engineering. Right? We are social engineers, techno-utopians who want to solve problems. So you have humanitarianism, objectification of poor people, or poor people as objects of charity, and social engineering. We're going to come in, we're going to plan, and we're going to move you guys around. And so what the problem is, poor countries are not laboratories for experiments by white bureaucrats in Brussels or Washington, D.C., or in Lima, or in Buenos Aires, for that matter. Okay? Or in countries throughout Africa. But so many, both African leaders, Latin American, Asian leaders, and then, you know, kind of development experts have treated poor people like experiments, right? In the name of social justice or in the name of charity. So, I think that this leads into the third part of my talk, which are the institutions of justice and rethinking justice for the poor. Now, we often think about poor people, and we think of an entrepreneur in the poor country, and we just think of this lady in a little shop doing her thing, etc. So we have to ask ourselves, why is it that entrepreneurs in Africa or Latin America don't emerge the way they do, say, in parts of the United States or Europe or whatever? Okay. Now, one of the things Pope Francis has stressed is he says, quote, "We must say no to an economy of exclusion and inequality." We must say no to an economy of exclusion and inequality. And this echoes St. John Paul, who said, quote, "Poverty in today's circumstances is primarily a matter of exclusion from networks of productivity and exchange. It is not to be understood simply or simplistically as a matter of having unequal and inadequate portion of what is imagined to be a fixed number of goods," end quote. So there's no shortage of potential entrepreneurs in the developing world, right? The question is, why don't they emerge? Why don't they come up? What's happening? And I would say that there are four main reasons why they don't come up. I mean, there's a lot of reasons, but here's four of them. There are four institutions of justice that are essential to social justice, as Father Ronheimer talked about. Okay? And there are four things that are generally missing in the developing world that we take for granted. The first one, well, the four of them are private property or clear title to land. 2, rule of law or institutions of justice. 3, free association, the ability to start a business. And number 4, free exchange, the ability to trade. And underlying this is a moral ecology, which I'll talk about at the end. So the first thing is the lack of clear property rights. Now, some of you may know that in many countries, in some countries in the developing world, 50, sometimes 70% of the land has no title. Now, if you do not know who owns the land, you're not going to take risks. You're not going to start a business. Without clean and secure title, people's land can be easily taken away from them, especially the widow and the orphan. In China, for example, lack of secure property rights for rural farmers is a serious problem, where their land is taken away. Without clear title, people are stuck in low productivity jobs because they won't invest, right? If you don't own the land, if you don't know whose it is, you're not going to build it up. You're not going to build a garden or build a building and a factory and hire people when somebody can come and take your land from you. You won't do that, right? So you may be an entrepreneur. You may have all the incentive. You may have even a friend who has capital. But you won't do it if you don't own the land, because it could be stolen from you. All right? So if you look at this map, for example, this is a map of property rights, okay? The green areas are areas where there's high levels of property, clear, secure title. The red areas are where their title is not secure. Do you see a correlation between wealth, human flourishing, and poverty? See it? It's obvious, right? Green, red. The more secure property rights are, the wealthier the nations are. This is not rocket science, ladies and gentlemen. Okay. And this is an area where Catholic social teaching has a lot to say. We've already talked a little bit about private property and rerum novarum. Father Ronheimer did that, so I'll move forward. Second one, rule of law. The lack of property rights for the poor is just the tip of the iceberg. Oh yeah, okay, that's stay here. Okay, it's just the tip of the iceberg. It's a larger pattern of the poor not having what we take for granted, the rule of law. And there's two ways. One is corruption. Okay? This is, this is the corruption one. Okay? Freedom from corruption. Okay? Look at freedom for corruption. Again, where there's lower levels of corruption, there's higher levels of wealth and productivity. Where there's higher levels of corruption, there's lower levels of wealth and productivity. It's very simple. Okay? According to the, so let me give you some examples. Okay? Ready? You got the map down? Okay. Two of the problems they face are, one, they have little or no access to justice in the courts. Okay? Number one, they lack little or no access to justice in the courts. Okay? They can't go to the court and get their case heard and get, if there's something goes wrong, they can't get themselves taken care of. Let me give you an example. According to the Research Foundation for Governance in India, there is a backlog of about 31 million cases that will take 320 years to be resolved. Okay? On average, it takes 20 to 25 years, according to this research think tank in India, 20 to 25 years for justice to be served. And then the cost of litigation is so expensive that only the rich, so the rich have fair advantages. So if you're poor, illiterate, widow, orphan, you are excluded. A second problem is people are locked out of the formal economy. They can't register the economy without burden. Okay? So again, here's business freedom. When there's more business freedom, there's more productivity. There's less business freedom. It's very simple. All right, let me give you some examples. In Nigeria, obtaining necessary permits still takes more than 100 days and costs over 30 times the level of average annual income. Let me give you a parallel. What's the average annual income in Austria? No. What's the average annual income?
The average annual income.
What's the average?
Median income is about 16,700 euros a year.
Okay, so say 17,000 euros a year. That means it takes 170,000 euros to start a business, plus 200 days. In the United States, it's about $40,000, right? Which is, okay, all right. So, Hernando de Soto, how many people have read Hernando de Soto's book, The Mystery of Capital? Okay, de Soto did a study where he set up a little sewing machine shop on the outskirts of Lima, like 5 kilometers from the town. 2 sewing machines, you know this? And so what he did was he set it up and he decided he was going to follow all the rules to register his business. Now, he had registered his business. And the lawyer friend, he was talking to a lawyer friend, and the lawyer said, it's no problem, we can set up a business. He said, okay, yeah, but what if you're poor? What if you don't have a driver to take you around or hire a lawyer? What if you just have to do it like a regular person? So he set up this business, he took the experiment, and he hired 4 student lawyers to go out and follow every single one of the regulations, filling out the papers, everything. And they took the bus, just like a poor person would. And they worked 8 hours a day. You know how many days it took them? 289 days to register their business. Okay. Well, what were they? But they couldn't work because they were registering their business. Okay, so they are locked out of the formal economy. They are locked out. They are not dominated by markets. You hear that a lot. Poor people, oh, they're dominated by markets. No, they're not. They're locked out of markets. Okay, they are excluded. And this is related to the whole idea of free exchange that I talked about yesterday. Right? It is a violation of allowing people just to start businesses. You have high levels of regulation where people are benefiting from and the poor are suffering. And the last thing I want to talk about is free exchange, which I actually talked about in the last class on accident. It just came out. Is that, you know, people will say, oh, free exchange hurts the poor, it's bad for the poor, competition hurts the poor. But as I said before, when governments get involved in regulating an industry, they make lots of complex rules that get influenced by businesses, unions, other pressure groups, environmentalists, NGOs. Everybody's making the rules. And the poorest of the poor lack the contacts, the social contacts, the economic contacts, the political contacts to navigate this system. So regulation oftentimes doesn't help the poor. It actually further excludes and hurts the poor. Okay? And I told you about the farmer in the United States, Joel Salatin. He's great. He wrote his book, He's a very successful entrepreneur. But he wrote a book, Everything I Want to Do is Illegal. Because the agricultural regulations are dominated by big agricultural companies. And so the middle-sized farmer like Joel Salatin, he's struggling constantly against ridiculous regulations. All right. So what the poor need, right, more than they need anything else, is justice, right? But not the kind of social justice that means simply distribution, but actually justice that Father Ronheimer talked about. That the institutions of justice, private property, rule of law, free association, free exchange. And this requires a strong state. Now people, oh, you don't care about the state. You don't want a state. Of course, we need a state. How else are you going to get private property, rule of law, free association, and free exchange? You need a strong state, but it's a limited state that's focused. The state has an important role to play. One thing is, oh, you're an anarchist. You don't want a state. Of course I don't. I want a state. I think states are important. I need states that we need them to help set up some of these very important institutions. The problem is in most poor countries, and increasingly in Europe and the United States, the state is neither effective nor limited. Okay? Instead, it's invasive, extractive, and burdensome. The thing is, politics alone cannot solve the problem. There must be other cultural, moral, spiritual transformations. Okay? Now, the institutions of justice don't just arise out of nowhere. They don't just happen like, hey, we've got private property. Okay? Now, in their very well-regarded book, Why Nations Fail, by Acemoglu and Robinson. Has anybody read Why Nations Fail? Okay. They make a distinction between what they call inclusive and extractive political and economic institutions. Okay? That is, those countries that develop and succeed have inclusive political institutions that bring people in and allow them to participate. And those countries that fail have extractive institutions, right? They extract all the wealth for the political class or maybe the crony capitalists, okay? Now, a lot of this work is based on the work of Douglas North and the importance of institutions. It's actually a very good book. I recommend it. But I'd say one of their serious weaknesses is that they actually radically detach, in a very odd way, culture and institutions. They kind of limit culture to maybe simple ways and means, and they don't realize I think it's historically and sociologically naive. Institutions are a part and a product of culture, right? They're a part and a product of culture. And this is what partially the movie was talking about last night. Like Dawson says, you know, cultus, religion, is the driving force of culture. Dawson thinks that our modern cultus is technology. Something to think about it, okay? So in fact, there's a role, it's not simply a political problem or an economic problem, okay? It's not simply a political problem or an economic problem. You need a moral ecology. You need actual cultural transformation, right? And this actually, charity has a role. I mean, evangelization has a role in this. This is not, it's not radically separate, okay? You're not simply doing technical economics. Because, here's why. I would think there are three challenges I'd like to suggest, okay? 3 challenges. There are many, but I'd like to suggest 3. And here's one of them. Why do you need more of a moral ecology, a transformation? Because here, one of the reasons is this. The powerful and the wealthy don't actually have economic incentives to build up the institutions of justice. They're doing fine, right? They're fine under the status quo. They're benefiting from extractive political institutions. They have connections. They have access to special privileges, to mineral rights or bribery and corruption. So there's no need. They have no economic incentive to get the institutions of justice. So that's why there has to be a work on evangelization, in culture, education, right? And I think the gospel, fundamentally, just having this awareness. Economic incentive alone is no, you don't need it if you're wealthy. Okay? I would even argue that sometimes the middle class in these wealthy countries, they don't have it either. Yes, they can grouse and complain against how crony capitalism, but they have maids and servants and all these other things. And guess what? How many people in Austria, how many people in Germany, how many people in the United States have maids, have servants? Not very many. I mean, simple bankers, but not average people. Okay? No, I mean, you know, we don't have maids and servants, right? So there's actually an economic disincentive to have inclusive economies if you already are on the top or even the middle. So that's why it's not alone. This is the problem with Acemoglu and Robinson. How do you solve it? We need moral ecology, and this is cultural transformation, because institutions of justice come out of this. Now, it's true, it is true that if you have more inclusive economies, you're going to have economic growth, better lifestyle, etc. That's all true. But it's not an immediate incentive for the wealthy and even the middle class. So this is one of the challenges, why you need a moral transformation. Okay? Second, I would say, okay, the second big challenge to the poor and to justice for the poor is the myth of unfettered capitalism. This is a big myth. Okay? It's completely common. It's totally mainstream. There's only one problem with it. It's false. Okay? I was at a conference. I was telling somebody. I was at a conference at the Academy of Management. Sitting next to me were two professors, one from Berkeley, one from MIT, a German guy from MIT, very prestigious, you know, MIT. I'm nobody. He kept talking about the biggest problem we have is unfettered capitalism, Reagan and Thatcher and all these things like this. And finally I said, this is not true. It's not true. I said, name one place where unfettered capitalism exists. Name one. Okay. Well, maybe Hong Kong. Oh, yeah, that's a terrible place. Okay, I mean, name one. So I say, okay, in Europe, 40% of GDP is controlled by the state.
More.
That's average. That's average in Europe. Is it higher now? Higher. Are you sure? Okay, it's okay. But at least on average, 40% of GDP. Same in the United States. 40% of GDP is controlled by the state, with government debt ratio of over 100% of GDP. In Latin America and Africa, the percentage of government spending and GDP are actually a little lower, but there are hundreds of other barriers. The state is always involved. Okay? Now, Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, thought that the maximum level of state control of the economy, maximum, would be 25%. Okay? So the average European American, now here we have very prestigious people, big economists, the New York Times and all the things, you know, we have unfettered capitalism. No, we don't. We have fettered capitalism. And the people who are most fettered are not us. The people who are most fettered are the poorest of the poor, who are totally locked out. But we're not locked out. They are. And so this is a super big challenge to the poor, because every time we are sanctimonious about, oh, you know, we need to regulate the economy, and it's so unfettered, we are not helping the poor. We may think ourselves sophisticated, but we are not helping the poor, because that's not the challenge they face. Now again, ladies and gentlemen, I am not saying a lawless, anything goes economy is a good thing. Of course, that's a bad thing. I just said you need the institutions of justice. Okay? What I'm saying is that the unfettered capitalism that we hear so much about doesn't really exist. And therefore, it's a distraction from the real issue. If you're always, there's a line, one of my favorite lines from this one saint. He says, don't go chasing lions in hallways, because there are no lions in hallways. Well, that's what we're doing. We're chasing lions in hallways. We're chasing things that are not true. It's a distraction from the real thing. An economy controlled from the top down that benefits politicians and corporate insiders and excludes the poor is the problem. As I said earlier, the poor are not so much dominated by markets, they are excluded for them. The next challenge that I would talk about is briefly that the idea that charity is the solution to poverty. Charity or redistribution is not the solution to poverty. Generally, business is the solution to poverty. The problem is, ladies and gentlemen, and I pardon my vulgarity, business and private property and rule of law and institutions of justice, this is not sexy. Okay, excuse my vulgarity. I mean, you can't have like a campaign like, I'm going to bring all my actor friends in here and all the celebrities and be like, yeah, private property, you know, rule of law, right? No, I mean, no, it's like everybody has to have a national action plan to extend extreme poverty in the next 35 minutes. Sign in, text here. Let's text if you like private property rights. I mean, nobody does that. So this is a serious challenge, but we're not called to be sentimentalists. These challenges are complex. There's no simple solution to poverty. It cannot be solved simply by policy reform. It requires spiritual transformation, moral clarity, a hunger for justice, prudence, charity, truth. It includes serious thinking about economics. It takes serious thinking about the dignity and the creative capacity of the person. And it takes humility to realize that maybe some ideas we have don't always work. Because we're going to have to try things and they're going to fail. But it also takes a recognition that the main question is not how we end poverty, but how people create wealth for their families and communities. Now listen, there will always be poverty. There will always be suffering that will require human love. At the end of Deus caritas est. So there will always be a need for human love. Philip, I think it was Philip or Father Ronheimer showed it yesterday, so I don't need to repeat it. We'll always have a need for almsgiving. Economic development alone will not solve our problems. There will always be poor people who cannot help themselves. There will always be poor people who need our care, the sick and the suffering, the widow and the orphan. And we must care for the widow and the orphan in their distress. But for the majority of the world's poor, the problem is not one of charity or one of redistribution. The problem is the poor lack the institutions of justice that enable them to create prosperity for their own families and their own communities. Right? Thank you.